to get burn-in problems. So does that mean that OLED is worth recommending for productivity use in that sense? Again, it kind of depends on the amount of productivity that you're doing. If you're at the more heavy end of the scale, I think it's a definite avoid at this point until we've got strong evidence that those sorts of panels will last the test of time. For the more moderate mixed uses, depends on how much of a mixture you're getting. But if your productivity use is relatively minimal across the course of a week, maybe it's under 20 hours a week, I think OLED, you could probably get away with it. And then obviously for primarily gaming applications, obviously not too much of an issue. But just to reiterate, with burn-in considerations and concerns, it's not so much about mixing it up between use cases. It's very much just how much of that static application usage are you doing cumulatively. So if you do 2 hours of productivity work, then 10 hours of gaming, or 2 hours of productivity work, then you turn your monitor off, you're still adding 2 hours of burn into the monitor. So just keep that in mind. Make sure you're keeping an eye on our burn-in test to make sure that the level of burn-in that you're seeing in those tests is acceptable for you. You're willing to take that risk. Then I think you're going to get a lot out of an OLED monitor. I've been really enjoying using one for productivity work. But the cost that we're seeing from some of those OLED monitors, the expected lifespan at those sort of price ranges, and what we're seeing from the burn test does make it a little prohibitive to recommend it for, say, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. So I mean, if OLEDs become really cheap, they're like $200 each, you could probably get away with using it for just a few years, then getting a new one isn't great from an e-waste perspective, but if that does become the reality, then it's going to be much easier to recommend it for productivity again. But in the situation that we're at the moment, I'd be hesitant to recommend an OLED for productivity of that scale. Often there's an absolute difference between monitors in terms of performance, but what's less clear is how much that difference matters. This is of course subjective, but what do you personally consider a significant difference in things like cumulative deviation, color performance and brightness that would lead you to spend more or save a little money compared to another similarly performing model? So that's a great question. A lot to get into with this one. So with some of these aspects to performance, it's really a personal preference thing. So for example, with brightness, SDR brightness at least, if you want to use a monitor at 200 nits, all you need to make sure is that your monitor supports 200 nits. And the fact that it could do 400 or 500 nits is pretty much irrelevant because you just wouldn't use that feature. Whereas if you really need 500 nits, then of course you want to make sure your monitor does it. So some of those things, again, like brightness, is going to come down to that. For things like HDR brightness, for example, this is really complicated because the way that you perceive brightness is non-linear. So for example, going from 100 to 200 nits is a huge difference, even though it's only 100 nits of difference. But if you go from 1000 to 2000 nits, which is the same sort of doubling of brightness, it can be a lot harder to perceive. That's because, just the way that your mind sort of perceives brightness can be different at different brightness levels. So that makes it hard if you're talking about, say, one monitor does 800 nits in HDR, another monitor does 1000 nits, compared to, say, 400 and 500 nits. You can probably get a lot more out of going from 400 to 500 nits than you would from going 800 to 1000 nits. So that's quite complicated, but generally higher numbers are better. But at least with HDR monitors, the way I think of it is once you get above that sort of 600 nit range, you really want to start seeing quite substantial gains in brightness for it to be noticeable. So that's why we don't really get caught up in things like, one monitor does 800 nits in this test scene, another does 1000 nits. They will look very similar in those conditions, but for say a 10% brightness test, if you've got an OLED that does 400 nits compared to an LCD that does 1000 nits, that will be very noticeable. With things like cumulative deviation, again, it's not really like a CPU or a GPU where you might be able to tell, say, a 15 or 20% performance difference in the games that you're playing. With things like motion performance, again, it depends on the refresh rate of a monitor. So at 60 Hertz, you could see quite a large difference in cumulative deviation and not really be able to notice it because the refresh rate is too low. It's just blurring a lot of the image. But once you start getting up to, say, 240 nits, then smaller differences in cumulative deviation can become more noticeable. But what I tend to look for is that there's a lot of monitors that are 20-30% better in cumulative deviation. That's not going to be very noticeable. You tend to need to get, it's hard to put a number on it, but 40-50% is where you start to see the really substantial differences, and where you probably in gaming scenarios be able to tell, that monitor that's 50% better is definitely clearer for my gaming experience. So that's really what we try and look for, but again, it does depend on the sort of areas that we're looking at, the monitors that we're looking at, the specs that we're looking at. And then when it comes to things like color performance, I tend to think that is a combination of the things that we've been talking about. in some areas like color accuracy, you just may not care all that much about the accuracy of a monitor, or even want a more vibrant, more oversaturated experience. You might want to mess around with the contrast so that you can see enemies more easily in multiplayer games. For all that sort of thing, it doesn't really matter what we show in terms of the color metrics, and you're just going to be looking out for things like how vibrant is the monitor, how big is the color gamut, can I get a much more saturated experience, or alternatively, you'll just ignore all of that entirely. But if we're talking about people that are interested in accuracy, that want the best color performance from that standpoint, then it's hard to say. There's kind of a threshold that we like to look for, which is monitors delivering a Delta E ITP of below 5. I tend to think that delivers quite an accurate experience. It's not perfectly accurate. That would be, you know, your Delta E's around the 2.0 level, 3.0 level. But generally, all of the monitors below a Delta E of 5.0 are going to look pretty good. So if you think about it as sort of a threshold thing, below 5.0 and above 5.0, then that's going to give you sort of that separation between monitors. Of course, if you're talking about, say, like a 4.5 and a 5.5, it's not going to be that big of a difference. But that's, you know, that tends to be how we separate the two monitors into those sort of categories. And then you can get progressively better. So a monitor near 2.0 compared to 5.0 is going to look a little better. But what I tend to look for in terms of talking about like, oh, that monitor looks really bad for colors compared to looks really good, is going to be those sort of, you know, 5.0 Delta E differences, that sort of thing. So if you've got one monitor that had a Delta E average of say 4 and another that had a Delta E average of 8, that could look quite different, especially if you're trying to use the monitors side by side. And it can also depend on the exact areas we're looking at for color performance. So white balance is something that could be very noticeable. So if a monitor is slightly tinted red, that may have a Delta E difference of say 4 Delta E's between the two monitors, which could be very noticeable. But then you get to a Delta E difference of 4 for say color performance, could be a little harder to tell the difference between those products. So again, it really depends on the sorts of things that you're looking at. But the way I tend to look at monitors and the way I'd think about it, if you're a PC enthusiast, is less about the differences we see from CPUs and GPUs, where again 10, 15, 20% can be quite a substantial difference between products. For monitors, you really need to be looking at more like 40, 50% differences before things start to become really noticeable. So yeah, that's hopefully a helpful summary for some of those monitor performance characteristics. HDR. What makes a true HDR experience, and why are so many monitors not that? What is the difference? Is it just not HDR if it's not OLED? What other monitor features are important? So things becoming true HDR was a very big issue in the early days of HDR monitors, because we were dealt with LCDs that had, well, really no HDR characteristics at all. So the things that I'm looking for when it comes to like true HDR versus fake HDR, a fake HDR monitor is a monitor where if you're using it in the HDR mode, it basically just looks like the SDR mode, except potentially with slightly different color processing or just higher overall brightness. So if you take an SDR monitor, which has, again, no real HDR hardware capabilities because it's built for SDR, you crank up the brightness to say 400 nits, and then you slightly tweak how you show colors. So you might change the gamma curve a little bit, you know, make things appear a little darker in some areas and a little brighter in some areas. Then that's just a